Can't have gone anywhere. If you honestly have to ask that question, it is a simple statement of the obvious that countries and cultures have differences.
What
it doesn't
cultures?
mean
Specifically, what are the cultural specificities?
Okay, I'll give you the history lesson. This country has, throughout most of its history...
Douglas Murray totally schooled anti-UK girl, Maya Goodfellow, on the basics of immigration and globalisation. Using logic and facts, he tore apart her arguments and made a crucial case we should all pay attention to. He didn't hold back at all with his history lessons.
David was speaking about it, have seen rapid change in front of their eyes, and they've also been sneered at by the liberal intelligentsia as racists.
So I think that's a bit of a crude analysis of what's actually happened. I think the whole immigration debate needs to be put in the broader context in which migrants have been consistently scapegoated. So we've seen migrants blamed for low pay, we've seen them blamed for crumbling public services. And what's actually going on, all the evidence shows from the LSE to the OECD that migrants aren't a significant factor in low pay, and that it's underinvestment in our public services that's leading to them to collapse. So I think that there are a number of things going on with people's cultural anxiety. I think that is a real thing. I'm not denying that it is. And we need to look at the other factors alongside immigration. But just to talk about immigration first, I think that the whole immigration debate, it needs to be recognised. Zubaida Haq from the Runnymede Trust has talked about this, that anti-immigration sentiment is not always correlating with the numbers of immigrants in the country. So if you go back to 1978, you will see that when there was net migration was 0, you will see that 70% of people in Britain said that they felt that their culture was being swamped by migrants. So what that tells us is that we need to be recognising that anti-immigration sentiment is very deeply entrenched in this country.
Maya Goodfellow thinks we need to look at the bigger picture when it comes to immigration. She argues that migrants often get unfairly blamed for things like low wages and failing public services. But the real issues are underinvestment in public services and other factors. She points out that anti-immigration feelings in the UK have been strong even when migration numbers were low, suggesting that these sentiments are deeply rooted. But then the host interrupts and asks an important question.
So if you go back to 1978, you will see that when there was net migration was 0, you will see that 70% of people in Britain said that they felt that their culture was being swamped by migrants. So what that tells us is that we need to be recognising that anti-immigration sentiment is very deeply entrenched in this country, and we need to be addressing...
Is it? Because we've had a lot of attitudinal change on many social issues since 1978, which goes against that particular time. So can you compare like with like?
Well, I think that what we can look at is the fact that there has consistently been a hostile environment to migrants. If you look at government policy from the 1960s, there was a concerted effort to keep migrants of colour out of this country. So what I'm saying is not that we should be ignoring people's concerns, what are often deemed legitimate concerns by politicians, but we should be recognising that instead of just calling people racist, we should be addressing why there is prejudice.
Maya Goodfellow believes there's a history of policies against migrants of colour, and that we should focus on breaking down prejudices and recognising commonalities among people. On the other hand, Douglas Murray's take on this makes sense when you consider that saying immigration isn't a big deal for problems like low pay and failing services doesn't address real concerns. While underinvestment in services is a real issue, we also need to recognise that too much immigration can strain resources and change the cultural landscape, as mentioned by Douglas when asked.
You've written about the challenges, the cultural challenges. What would you say to Maya, what you've heard from Maya?
I entirely disagree. I think you would be hard-pushed to find a single country in the world that has been as tolerant and as welcoming of migration as this one. I cannot think of one anywhere in the world. I've travelled widely, not just on our continent, but across the world, and I can assure you that if the numbers that came into this country over the post-war period up to now had gone into any other country in the world, we would be seeing a very different response. And I think this is a knee-jerk assault on the British people, which is continuing and should stop. We were talking earlier about some of the economic implications. The economic implications of globalisation include the possibility that people born in this country, at the same time as somebody in this country has a child, they are competing with dozens of other children around the world to get to the lifestyle benefits that people across the world would dream of and which people in this country think is their birthright. And that's changing. And that's going to change across all sorts of parts of the developed world.
Douglas Murray completely disagrees with Maya's view. He argues that it's hard to find a country as tolerant and welcoming to migrants as the UK. Having travelled widely, he believes if other countries had received the same number of migrants as the UK, their responses would be much less accepting. He thinks the criticism of British attitudes is unfair and should stop. Murray also points out that globalisation means people in the UK are competing with many others worldwide for resources and opportunities, which challenges the idea that these benefits are a birthright. To make his point, he later points out how it's changing.
And one of the things that makes that change far, far more painful is the idea that it will happen simultaneously with an assault on their identity. Because people can potentially take the stagnation of wages, they can potentially take the living standards questions, but if at the same time you say, oh, and by the way, maybe we don't always say you're racist, but we sort of imply it, then I think you're going to build up a lot of problems for the future. And by the way, very quickly on your 1970s point, one of the things about migration is it takes a long time for that effect to happen. If you look at the opinion polls on migration in this country that followed the influx after the Blair government, it took time for people's attitudes to, as it were, harden on migration, precisely because the impact of that migration takes the time to happen.
Douglas Murray strongly criticises the view that British society is inherently anti-immigrant, emphasising that the UK has a long history of tolerance and integration compared to global standards. He argues that anti-immigration sentiment often comes from genuine concerns about rapid changes and integration challenges, not just prejudice.
So as well as it were, misrepresenting the facts, I think you just have to be extremely careful not to say, this country, which is, as I say, the most tolerant country in the world, is in fact the most bigoted, because if you travel anywhere around the world, you will see a very different picture.
Research supports that public worries about immigration are more linked to sudden demographic shifts and their impact on community identity and stability than to the number of immigrants. For example, studies show that people are more anxious about the pace of change and its effects on public services and jobs than outright xenophobia. The data also reveals that many support immigrants who contribute positively to the economy or integrate well into society.
On your point about the constant movement, actually, the movement into these islands in particular has been really minimal what was the biggest event over the last millennia? The Norman Conquest. About a 5% population shift as a cause of the Norman Conquest. So this idea that, as it were, the movement has been perennial. Also, the movement that you're talking about most of the time is movement from France with the Huguenots, for instance, Protestant French people, or movement from Ireland into what we now call mainland Britain. That is not the same as somebody from Eritrea or Ghana or Myanmar moving in to live in Salford. It's a totally different movement.
Douglas Murray makes a strong case that the UK has shown exceptional tolerance and hospitality towards migrants, more so than most other countries. This generosity should be acknowledged, not criticised. It's important to address these concerns seriously and not dismiss them as mere xenophobia. Historical migrations into Britain, such as the Norman Conquest, were relatively small and culturally similar compared to today's larger and more diverse migrations. The percentage of the population in England and Wales that was born outside the country from 1851 to 2024 shows that it's just an upward trend.
About people from Eritrea, Myanmar and
my
Ghana.
God,
Please
you
tell me
can't have gone anywhere.
Specifically.
You can't have gone anywhere. If you honestly have to answer that question. It is a simple statement of the
for our benefit.
obvious. A simple statement of the obvious that countries and cultures have differences.
What
it doesn't
cultures?
mean
Specifically, what are the cultural specificities?
I'll give you the history lesson. This country has, throughout most of its history, been for instance, a Christian country. It has been, I'm not a practicing Christian myself, but it has been historically a Christian country. It's been particularly a Protestant Christian country. With views, if I may just finish, you asked me to define something, and then I try and then you talk. You have institutions that, for instance, epitomise the country. In this country, the institutions that epitomised our country were an established monarchy, for instance, the establishment of Parliament, the establishment of the judiciary and of the law courts, the establishment of the great educational institutions. A whole set, I could go on and on.
Douglas Murray notes that the UK has been a Protestant Christian country for a long time, with institutions like the monarchy, Parliament, judiciary and schools deeply rooted in these values. This has given the nation a sense of continuity and stability. To maintain that, we should remain open to others, but also stay true to our cultural and religious values to keep shaping and defining our nation.
Douglas's point originally, which I think we need to probe more, is this idea that
probe away.
Is that this idea that British society, he listed the monarchy, he listed Parliament, that is somehow under threat from people from Eritrea, Ghana and Myanmar. That's not clear to me how that's the case. You've listed all these institutions, but you haven't really explained exactly what it is that is under threat from these people, from institutions, but you haven't really explained exactly what it is that is under threat from these people.
A quick answer from Douglas, because he has to answer that, because he's had a direct... He's had a direct challenge there, and then Sam, I'm going to come to you, and Linda, I'm going to go Linda first, then Sam, but Douglas, answer that direct challenge from Maya.
What this Maya does not get to understand is that the monarchy, Parliament, and other key institutions have been the backbone of British society for centuries. While it's important to be compassionate and welcoming, we must ensure that the core identity of our nation remains strong. Allowing significant cultural changes without protecting our values could erode the very fabric that holds British society together.
You can do it on all sorts of things. You can do it on historical attitudes, or you can do it on, for instance, current social attitudes, which is, I'll throw out as one example. And take an example that Nikki just cited of tolerance. I think we agree in Britain that we're a tolerant country, we're meant to be a tolerant country, we try to be a tolerant country, and so on. There's been polling in recent years that actually shows that the more immigration you have, the less tolerance you have on certain issues, not because we, the British people, have become intolerant, but because people come with views of their own. Let me give you a very quick example. A poll carried out 2 years ago by YouGov asked people their opinions on homosexuality, morally acceptable or morally not acceptable. Across the country as a whole, about 14% of the British people said homosexuality not morally acceptable. In London, it was double that. Why would that be? Is it because London, the capital city, is just a particular home of homophobia? Or might it be, as I would suggest it is, because people come into the country with attitudes of their own? And you may deprecate that, and I deprecate that, but we should at least acknowledge it, and you're trying to cover it over.
He makes a good point here. For example, studies from the Pew Research Centre show that many people in Western countries feel their culture is being lost due to global influences. In the US, 62% of Americans think their way of life needs protection from foreign influence, reflecting a broader global trend. Other experts, like David Coleman from Oxford University, share Murray's concerns. Coleman has studied how immigration affects national demographics and points out that without good integration strategies, rapid changes in the population can leave parts of society feeling alienated. This can hinder the development of a shared national identity and increase divisions within society. So, what do you think about the impact of these cultural shifts on British society and its core values? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest news and discussions. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.